today we're very happy to have Giacomo. Is that the right pronunciation of your name? Uh,
That's right. Giacomo.
from HEC Montreal. So he got his degree from Boston College back in 2016, right? And he has very good publication record like in RE-Stat, JME, JIE, JDC, RED, etc. So today he's going to talk about risky business cycles. So time's yours.
Thank you for this very kind introduction and for having me. So this is joint work with Sushanta Basu, Ryan Sharur, and Rosen Valchev. And we investigate the sources of business cycles. So in particular, we start by a couple of motivating facts that are very well known in the macrofinance literature. On the financial side, we know that risk premia on many risky assets tend to be volatile and counter-cyclical. So if you think about your typical asset pricing decomposition from Campbell and Schindler, that would tell you that a lot of fluctuations in asset prices are really due to changes in what they call discount rates, so expected excess returns, as opposed to changes in expected future dividends. And since this finding, it's been sort of the central organizing question in asset pricing research that of understanding variations in these discount rates. In terms of the macro perspective, we know that business cycles are really defined by the typical co-movement that we observe across macro variables. To put it in Lucas' words, one is led by the facts to conclude that with respect to the qualitative behavior of co-movement among series, business cycles are all alike. And Lucas was pointing to the fact that during all the recessions that we have experienced, typically output, consumption, investment, and employment all fall jointly during these recessions. So because of this cyclicality in risk premia and this co-movement in business cycles, there is a long-standing interest in thinking about a theory where risk and changes in risk could be the source of business cycle fluctuations. This is an idea that dates back at least to Keynes in his general theory. Nevertheless, there is a challenge a theoretical challenge in getting risk-driven fluctuations to give you the hallmark co-movement of business cycles. That is because typically in many of the models that we write, when you have an increase in risk, there are strong precautionary motives that would make agents reduce their consumption but increase their savings. And in general, equilibrium saving is going to be equal to investment. So that already tells you that consumption and investment tend to move in opposite directions. On top of that, if agents provide more labor as a precautionary measure against this increase in risk, and labor supply and employment would go up, driving output up in the opposite direction of consumption. So this has been an observation that is known to macroeconomists for a long time, and it's in general difficult to get around this in real business cycle models. So in this paper, we're going to try to make progress on this question of risk-driven business cycles, both empirically and theoretically. What we're going to do empirically is to show...
Can I ask a quick conceptual question? When you talk about the risk, what do you mean? Is that like what is the perception of the uncertainty, or how you price? Is the quantity of the uncertainty, or the price, how agents price the uncertainty?
That's a good question. So it's going to be irrelevant whether it's an actual change in the quantity of risk or in the perception of this risk or the pricing of this risk. So the results that I'm going to show you are going to apply both if you increase the quantity of aggregate risk in the economy, or if you just increase risk aversion in the economy. We're going to work with the latter for the most part. So we're going to assume that there are changes in risk attitudes, so changes in risk.
That's how you do it in your theoretical model. Is the people's risk aversion. It's kind of, you model it kind of as a risk aversion shock, right?
Yes, we're going to model it as a risk aversion shock. but qualitatively, you would get the same results if you were to increase the variance of aggregate productivity, let's say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But coming back before theory, coming back to empirics, the first thing that we do in the paper is to isolate a shock that explains the majority of fluctuations in expected excess equity returns. So these are equity risk premia, if you want. And we find that this shock is also a shock that generates a strong fall in output, consumption, investment, and employment when these equity excess returns are high. Not only that, but the shock that explains these fluctuations in equity risk premium also accounts for a lot of fluctuations in these macro indicators. So this is the sense in which we argue that equity risk premium fluctuations and business cycle fluctuations are intimately connected in the data. To make progress on what is behind these spikes in equity risk premium, we also look for the response of other variables that could be informative about the nature of the shock. And we find that these shocks in equity risk premia have small effects on firms' cash flows or firms' profitability. They are fairly disconnected from inflation and from movements in safe interest rates. So this, for us, is pointing away from traditional theories of supply shocks or New Keynesian typical textbook demand shocks, or even intertemporal substitution motives. What we find that is very telling in the data is that when this equity risk premia spike up and we have a recession, there is also a shift towards part-time and flexible contract type of workers. So firms appear to shift away from hiring full-time workers towards hiring these more flexible type of workers. So this is the first sign that there is a reallocation going on in the economy when risk premia increase. So that motivates us to write a theory of business cycles that is based on a real model where these increases in risk or risk aversion are going to drive the full movement that we see in the data. The story is actually based on two ingredients that are fairly intuitive. The first one is that much like safe financial assets tend to come with lower expected returns, if you translate this idea into real investment technologies, that means that safe real investments will typically have lower marginal products. So if you have an economy where you can save in different types of real technologies, that could be capital, but it could also be labor if there are certain matching frictions, such that labor becomes a form of investment for the firm, then this is telling you that the real saving technologies in equilibrium they're going to have lower marginal products. The second observation is that when there is an increase in risk, you not only want to save more, so there's not only a change in desired savings, but there's also going to be a reallocation of these savings towards what is safer. So if you put these two together, you have that conceptually when there are increases in risk premia, there is what we call a real flight to safety. So the economy is going to shift investments towards vehicles that have lower marginal products. And if this loss in productivity is strong enough, that you can have a full-fledged recession. So we're going to first highlight this idea in a simple model that is analytical and where firms can choose between investing in physical capital and labor. Labor is going to be a form of investment because of search and matching frictions. So there is an initial outlay to hire a worker, a cost of posting a vacancy, and then the worker provides cash flows to the firms for several periods. That's the sense in which it is an investment. And we're going to show how reallocation can happen, this flight to safety can happen in the simple model. In the quantitative exercise, we're going to add more layers to this story, and we're also going to allow a choice between two types of workers, one that we label a full-time worker and a part-time worker. And crucially, the estimation is going to tell us that part-time workers are going to be perceived as safer from the point of view of the firm. And this is the reason why during a recession, we see a spike in part-time employment. So this story not only delivers the co-movement across macro variables, but also the shift towards the part-time that we observe in the data. And of course, with the quantitative model, we can quantify the importance of this channel and do counterfactual exercises to see which of these reallocation mechanism is really important for explaining recessions. So we connect to a lot of.
Can I ask another question? So why is a flight to safety? Put it another way, why do you think labor is risky than capital?
So that's an important question. We do not assume ex ante that labor is more risky than capital, but our estimation is going to tell us that this is the case. So we're going to estimate several parameters in this model that include things that are related to the riskiness of capital, like the capital adjustment cost, and also parameters that are related to the riskiness of labor, such as the degree of wage rigidities and the degree of persistence in these labor relationships. So I'll be more specific as to those elements later, but it's a result from the estimation, the fact that labor is more risky than capital.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. In terms of the literature, this is a paper that touches on finance, macro, labor. So there's a lot of strands of the literature that we touch upon. In terms of the empirical literature, documenting time variation in risk premia and trying to get to the sources of business cycle fluctuations, I think our contribution is really to show that volatility and time variation in asset prices is not a phenomenon that is disconnected from business cycles, but indeed asset price fluctuations and business cycles share a common origin. And this is what we try to document empirically. In terms of the theory, there has been a lot of work thinking about changes in risk or uncertainty as a source of unemployment fluctuation, or even more broadly, business cycle fluctuations. I think here we provide a new propagation mechanism for changes in risk that doesn't necessarily rely on nominal rigidities or changes in underlying productivity to deliver the full co-movement that we observed during a recession. So this is what sets us apart from the previous work. In terms of the outline for this talk, I'll first show you the empirics, so how risk premia and business cycles are connected in the data. Then we're going to go through a simple analytical model that can tell us how and under which conditions we can have risk-driven business cycles. And then we're going to go to the full model to quantify the relevance of these forces. So in terms of the data, what are we going to do? We're going to try to establish an empirical connection between risk premium and business cycles. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to first take a standard macro approach by which we estimate a VAR with macro variables, but also financial variables, in particular equity and bond returns. Within this empirical framework, we're going to try to identify shocks that are responsible for fluctuations in these equity excess returns. And we're going to see how macro variables respond to these shocks, in particular, the typical macro aggregates, but also more precise labor market outcomes that I'll describe along as we go. So empirically, we're going to estimate a quarterly VAR with 3 legs on basically the post-World War II period up to the end of 2018, so before the pandemic. And the data that we use comprises 4 macro series: GDP, consumption, investment, and employment, and 3 financial series. These are real stock returns on the entire US stock market, real bond returns, and the dividend price ratio. Our objective here is to find the shock that explains equity risk premium. So first, we have to define what is the exposed excess return on stock over bonds. This is this second to last line here. It tells you that the excess return is the cumulative log return of stocks over an horizon of J periods, minus the corresponding log return on bonds for the same time horizon. Of course, risk premia are about ex ante excess returns. So we're going to have to measure the expectation of this exposed excess return. And for that, we're going to use the expectation that comes directly from the VAR. So inside our VAR, we can compute this conditional expectation of excess returns. And on the right-hand side of this last equation, this is just telling you that this is going to be a function of the reduced form shocks and their moving average representation, mu t. Now, the next step is going to be to try to orthogonalize these reduced form shocks in order to isolate the one that really explains these fluctuations in risk premia. And to do that, we're going to rotate the shocks according to this matrix A. As you know, there are infinite ways of rotating these shocks in an orthogonal way. We're going to build on this max share identification approach that says choose A such that the first shock of the resulting vector epsilon is going to explain most of the variation in an object of interest, where for us, the object of interest is really the risk premium. I see a raised hand, so I can take the question if there is one.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah.
A quick question is regarding the definition for ET, the conditional expectation. Is that
Yes.
conditional on the econometrician's information set or the market expectation?
It's the former. So it's going to be the econometrician or the VAR information set. So here the assumption is going to be that this conditional expectation is really based on knowing the variables of the VAR up to time t. We have experimented with different information sets, and I can discuss this in a couple of slides. Our finding here was that by including even more variables here, so having a bigger information set, at this point has only a very marginal effect on the predictability of these success returns.
Do you have a similar variable in the model? I mean, in the structural model that you are going to talk about later.
So in the model, it's a rational expectation model. So we're going to have a notion of expected excess return, which is going to be conditional on on all the state variables in the model at time t. So it's potentially conditional on a broader set of variables. But in the model, we're only going to have 2 structural shocks. So you can think that if I were to condition on the same set of variables for the expectation inside the model, that would probably span the state space of the model. Does that make sense?
Yes. My concern is how you're gonna connect this, the expectation from the VR, which is based on the econometrician's information set. How is this going to be connected to the model, the structural model, where the expectation is really based on the information set of the private sector?
Yes. Well, first of all, we're going to let me defer the question a little bit to when I get to the model. But in the model, I'm going to construct simply the rational expectation of that excess return. And my point would be that from the perspective of the data, if you were to expand this information set, my argument is that it wouldn't change the risk premium that we measure. And from the theory perspective, if you were to construct the expectation inside the model just based on this set of variables, you would probably obtain something quite similar to the full rational expectation. That's because the model has only 2 structural shocks, and this is a lot of observables that would allow you to back out the shocks and the state variables. So let me maybe come back to that also a bit later as I show you the empirical and theoretical results.
Can I ask a really quick question? So how do you compare your shock to the one which is identified by David Berger's IES paper, which says uncertainty is the second order shock?
So let me show you. So we don't compare the shocks directly, but let me show you the property of our shocks and how our shock moves macro variables, and then we can discuss if it's similar or different. Since we use a max share identification approach, which is also the approach used in Angeletos 2020, although Angeletos was targeting not risk premium, but he was targeting output or employment or consumption. We have a direct comparison of our shock to the main business cycle shock. And the answer there is that they are highly correlated, 80%. So you can think of our shock as being pretty close to the main business cycle shock.
Excuse me. So I understand you want to generate a shock that drives the co-movements among those 4 macro variables, right? So that's why you have output, consumption, investment, and employment in the VAR. And I also understand why you need to include the stock return and bond return, because the difference is the risk premium. Then why do you need to include the dividend price ratio? I guess it should be very important for you to generate that shock. So can you please provide some intuition why that is very important for the generation of your shock?
Yeah, so that's an important question. So as came up in the previous question, we want to construct a measure of ex ante excess returns that is that has some predictive power for the ex post excess return. Otherwise, the exercise wouldn't be too useful. In the finance literature, it is well known that the dividend price ratio is a very good predictor of ex post excess return. And indeed, we find in some exercises when we try to, for instance, take out the dividend price ratio from the information set of the VAR, that the predictability of excess return diminishes in significant ways. So our objective here is to have to start with a very good predictor of this excess returns, some predictors that would arguably be known by market participants, and then look at innovations in these expected excess returns. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that's the most important variable in your VAR for you to generate that shock?
Let me answer that in just one slide. I have
Okay,
it.
thank you.
So in terms of what we do, as I mentioned, we rotate these shocks to find a shock that explains most of the variation in this expected excess returns. We target the unconditional variance of these excess returns, and we focus on excess returns of 5 years. This is where the finance literature finds a lot of predictability. So that's what we focus on. It's important to realize that this rotation of the shocks that we do does not impose any structural interpretation of the shocks a priori, because it's just an orthogonal decomposition of the reduced form shocks. But we're going to try to impose some interpretation to this after looking at the response of different variables to the shock that we have identified. So before looking at the response, let me try to convince you that this way of predicting excess returns from the VAR information set is actually quite good. So here I have in the dashed line the exposed historical excess returns for the US stock market, and the black line is the expected excess return implied by the VAR inside the sample. So as you can see, exposed returns fluctuate a lot, and they tend to spike up during recessions. And our measure of expected excess return is quite good at predicting those movements in exposed returns. And in particular, the thing that we really care about is the fact that this expected excess return are really spiking up during recessions, which is consistent with the behavior of the exposed excess return. So if you were to regress the black line on the dashed line, you would get an R-square of 49%. So this tells us that there is a lot of predictability in this excess returns, and this is a finding that is consistent with the finance literature. So coming back to the question that I was asked before, like how important is this dividend price ratio? I have part of the answer here. If you just do a predictability exercise based on just the dividend price ratio, that already explains 28% of the exposed returns. So the other variables, you can think that the other variables that we have in the VAR are adding to that up to 49%. I also have a picture of a decomposition here that shows you what if you were to construct that expectation based on a subset of the variables that I have in the VAR. So what you can see here is that a lot of the predictability is coming from the joint inclusion of GDP and consumption. The R-square jumps up from 0.1 to 0.43. And then once you have GDP and consumption, the dividend price ratio is only helping at the margin in terms of the R-square. But if you look at the different colors in the picture, you see that the dividend price ratio is adding more volatility to the colored picture. So here, the idea is that having information on GDP relative to consumption is informative about expected excess returns. You can think that when the private sector is consuming a lot more relative to its income, then this is a sign that they expect returns to be high. And when the private sector is spending less on consumption than the total income in the economy, then this is a sign that returns are going to go low. And this is exactly what happens. Now that I hopefully convinced you that this is a good way of predicting excess returns, let's look at the responses of the economy to an innovation in that black line that is orthogonal to the other innovations in the VAR. So this is what we call a risk premium shock. We see that a risk premium shock is increasing the risk premium by about 1.25 percent relative to the average. And this increase in risk premium is quite persistent for over 4 years. Underlying this increase in risk premium, there is a sharp fall in stock returns on impact, and these stock returns then revert quickly to stay above average for a while. On the macro side, we see our first main result, which is that when this risk premium rise, we have a full-fledged recession. So we have output, consumption, investment, and employment all falling sharply and persistently. The second result that you can see from this picture is related to the numbers at the top of each panel. These numbers are telling you the fraction of unconditional of business cycle variance and unconditional variance that the risk premium shock explains of the variable depicted in the panel. So this tells you that our shock, almost by design, is explaining a lot of the fluctuations in the risk premium shock, 87% of its unconditional volatility. But it's also explaining a lot of business cycle fluctuations in output, investment, employment. That's about half of them, and a third of the fluctuations in consumption. So this is the sense in which we think risk premium fluctuations are really share the same origins as business cycle fluctuations. Next, we want to try to attribute some interpretation to the shock that we have identified. How do we do that? We're going to look for the responses to the shock of some other variables. We can do that basically by estimating an auxiliary regression, where we regress some series of interest on the variables that we have in the VAR, so that we can compute the responses of this additional series once we have the responses of the VAR. First of all, we want to kind of come back to the typical finance approach that decomposes asset prices fluctuations into changes in expected discounted profits versus expected excess returns. The finance literature tells us that asset price fluctuations are really due to changes in discount rates as opposed to profits. And this is indeed what happens in response to our shock. So the first panel that you see here is depicting the present discounted value of the profits in the non-financial sector following our shock, discounted back to time zero using the average interest rate, safe rate in the data. As you can see, the profitability in the non-financial sector is not being affected significantly by our shock. So this is consistent with the fact that the shock we have isolated is really a shock to risk premium as opposed to a shock to profitability. We also notice in these other panels down here that real interest rates, whether you look at short-term rates or long-term rates, are not really responding to the shock. And also our shock explains a very little portion of the business cycle fluctuations in these rates. So this is for us a piece of evidence that there is not a whole lot of change in the overall desire to save in the economy, because that should be showing up in a change in real rates, and in particular, it should go up. Also, we look at the response of the Gilchrist-Zachariasek bond premium spread, which is, as you can see, increasing on impact, but then it's quickly having a negative response and then coming back to zero fairly rapidly. So this non-monotonic response, together with the fact that, as I'll show you, inflation is not really moving in the expected direction, is pointing us to think that the shock that we have identified is not really a credit shock or a shock that is related to the typical financial friction story that people have been thinking about. On top of that, so we think that this panel kind of excludes typical stories of typical supply shocks or typical financial friction stories. So what could be behind this movement? Another possibility is the New Keynesian story. So the way that in the literature, people have reconciled risk fluctuations with business cycles is by adding nominal rigidities. If you have a change in risk or a change in uncertainty, that's going to depress aggregate demand. And if output is demand driven, that's going to translate into a fall in output and potentially a full-fledged recession. What are the implications of this story? Well, if this is really a demand-driven recession, we should observe a fall in inflation due to the slack in aggregate demand. And to the extent that the central bank tries to stimulate the economy, we should see a fall in nominal and real interest rates. Instead, this is what we find. We find that in response to our shock, inflation, if anything, is increasing initially and then quickly turning insignificant. And as I showed you before, the real interest rate is not really falling significantly. So it seems that this is not also, this is what we found in the data is not really the textbook New Keynesian demand shock. So we propose a different story, which is based on this idea of reallocation and flight to safety. We think that when there is an increase in risk in the economy that increases risk premia in the equity market, firms are going to restructure their operation to become safer, and they're going to do that by investing in lower productivity type of investments. If there is a loss in productivity due to this flight to safety, then we can have a fall in output that potentially is responsible for the recession. Where could we look for some hints about this? Well, one thing that we know from the literature is that there is a distinction between employment and part-time employment. Part-time employment tends to be, on average, counter-cyclical, and it's also known to be a safer choice from the point of view of the firm, because part-time employment typically comes with flexible compensations and with shorter contract durations. So the literature has thought about part-time workers as a way for a firm to reduce their risk profile. So our conjecture is that in response to our shock, we should see, if anything, an increase, at least in the share of part-timers that firms employ in response to our shock. And this is yes.
So you're saying that part-time workers are actually a safer choice from the firm's perspective. So how do you explain like a labor hoarding, you know?
So there's
firms trying to keep their workers during recessions.
Yes. So an increase in part-time worker doesn't necessarily mean that the firm is laying off its workers, its full-time workers, and hiring part-time workers. Actually, there is evidence that during recessions, firms are holding on to their workers, but they are switching their contracts from a full-time contract to a part-time contract. So the firm is actually consistently with what you said, it's holding on to its workers, but it's making them work as part-time workers. And this is the added.
So you're saying it's still the same person, but different compensation structure?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right, thanks.
And this is exactly what makes the firm operational structure more safe. Indeed, this is what we find in the data. In response to a risk premium shock, there is an increase not only in the share of part-time relative to total employment, depicted here on the right, but also in the absolute number of part-time workers that increased by 1% from steady state in response to this shock. You can also see that our shock explains quite a bit portion of fluctuations in this part-time measure, which is exactly in line with the story that we have in mind. So that's for the data. There is still a big question of how is it possible that this change, this reallocation, is responsible for a fall in all these macro quantities. It's far from obvious given the challenge that we have with this co-movement between consumption and investment. So what I want to do now is to give you the nutshell of the story that we're trying to tell in a simple model that is enough to drive home the intuition. So we're going to work with a 2-period model. It's a real business cycle model where there is a representative household that owns firms and supplies labor inelastically. And then the key ingredients are that there are 2 types of investment that the firm can do: capital and labor. Labor is a form of investment for the firm because there are search and matching frictions. So the firm is going to purchase capital and hire labor at the beginning of period 0 to produce output in period 0 and in period 1. And it's going to hold on to these inputs throughout period 1. So period 1 is the source of risk for this economy in a way that I'll explain in a second. So let me give you some details here. The household solves this maximization problem where it's maximizing the utility from consumption from both periods. We have these Epstein-Zinn preferences that are useful to separate the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, psi, from the risk aversion parameter, gamma. And the income from for the household is coming from labor income and the profits of the firm, which they own. Firms are solving a profit maximization problem where they maximize the discounted sum of their profits. The profits are coming from selling the output, and the firms can choose, as I mentioned before, capital. They can purchase capital at the beginning of period 0, and they can also hire labor and that it's going to stick around with the firm for both periods, subject to the search and matching frictions. So you would expect to see in this equation here the cost of posting vacancies. Here I have already substituted out vacancies with the market clearing condition for the search market, so that vacancies are effectively the ratio of hires divided by the job filling probability. This is possible because in this model, there is only one hiring period, which is the initial period. So this is the problem of the firm that takes the probability of filling a job vacancy as given. And there are 2 very important ingredients in this model. One is that the firm discounts the future profits with the household discount factor, this M01. So the firm is effectively risk averse with respect to future profits. And the other important thing is that productivity today is constant, but tomorrow is stochastic. It's this Z that follows a log normal distribution. So this is the source of risk in this economy. And the firm is going to care about that because of this stochastic discount factor here. So the first set of results that I want to show you from this very simple model is what we call a co-movement impossibility result. So when co-movement cannot arise. Imagine that in this economy, wages are set according to a flexible Nash wage bargaining, where the bargaining parameter is chosen such that we have efficient wages. So this means that the Nash wage in both periods is going to be a weighted average of the marginal product of labor and the outside option of the household that we have assumed to be 0 for simplicity. So it's just going to be proportional to the marginal product of labor. Under this setup with efficient wages, you can show that the risk premium on capital and labor must be the same. So these 2 investments are equally risky. And a consequence of that is that consumption, capital, and labor cannot all move in the same direction when you increase risk aversion or when you increase risk in this economy. What is the reason for this? let me try to give you some intuition. Intuition can be grasped from looking at the firm's optimality conditions for capital and labor, which are equating the marginal cost of the input, either capital or labor, to the expected present discounted value of that input. And that expected present discounted value takes into account the risk via this covariance term. So you can see that in this optimality conditions, on the right-hand side, you have the present discounted value of the input. On the left-hand side, you have the cost. So the ratio of the two is going to be a measure of expected returns or risk premium. And if you substitute one into the other, you're going to get to this equality down here. This equality is telling you that the expected excess returns of capital and labor must be the same at all times in this economy. This is the sense in which these two types of investment are equally risky from the point of view of the firm. And so this economy behaves as if there was only one saving vehicle. Whenever there is a change in risk or risk aversion, either capital and labor are going to go up or they're going to go down. And the way they move will depend on this intertemporal elasticity of substitution. If it's very high, or higher than one, then the substitution effects dominate. And when there is more risk, you want to lower capital and labor and increase consumption. Now, an important point here is that as you lower capital and labor, you free up some resources for consumption by the resource constraint. And so consumption necessarily has to go up. The converse is going to be true if size less than one. You're going to increase capital and labor, but that's going to reduce the resources left on the table for consumption. So consumption has to go down. This is the result that we find.
I'm a little confused here. So what do you say is when the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is high, and then the substitution effects are dominant, which means so what does that imply for?
So that means that remember, when there is an increase in risk, that means the certainty equivalent of tomorrow's consumption is going to fall.
Okay.
That's going to fall, and also the risk has gone up. So if you have a high intertemporal elasticity of substitution, you're going to move consumption to today because you don't care about the time profile of this consumption. So you prefer to have more consumption today and less consumption tomorrow.
Okay.
If instead you have a low elasticity of substitution, you don't like the fact that the consumption certainty equivalent of tomorrow has gone down, so you're going to try to equate the value of consumption tomorrow and today by increasing saving today. If you increase saving today, you're going to raise once again that certainty equivalent of consumption tomorrow.
Okay, I see. So, and then here you mirrored. You said, okay, this tool has the same risk. So you, I think on your equation on the right-hand side is kind of like the marginal product of labor minus the wage, right? So you said that average wage. So that is your risk measure for the labor.
Exactly, and it's the reason why I can write it like this, taking out the average wage, is that the wage that we have postulated is this one over here, where Z is shifting the wage up and down. So the essence of the result is the fact that in this economy, when productivity goes up, for example, then the marginal product of labor is going to go up, but also the wage that firms have to pay to the worker is going up. So this is creating some sort of insurance. When productivity goes down, the wage that the firm have to pay to the worker also goes down. So the cash flows of the firm are being insured as much as the cash flows of the firm that they get from capital are being insured in a way. So that's why there is this equality here. It's going to be, I think, even more clear when we move to the fixed wage case, because that's where the asymmetry begins.
I think the wage rigidity here still matter. It's kind of like if you have flexible wage, they are the same with the same riskiness. And then if you go to a completely sticky wage, basically that means the contract cannot change. So I think then like even in a recession, the firm still pay the same wage as they pay before recession. That make it a risk premium.
Yes.
Risky.
And that's exactly our next result. Exactly.
Okay.
So in this case where flexible wages, you cannot get this co-movement because capital and labor are equally risky. If instead you move to a scenario where you have rigid wages, suppose that the wages are set to a constant in the bargaining set and they don't adjust to productivity, then you can show, especially in the knife edge case where there would be no change in desired saving, that's when the intertemporal elasticity is equal to 1, that the risk premium on labor is going to be higher than the risk premium on capital. So labor is going to be now more risky because of this fixed wages. And this is the reason why you can have full co-movement following an increase in risk aversion after a certain threshold. So let me tell you why that's the case. When you have rigid wages, the labor becomes more risky than capital. The reason is exactly the reason that we have highlighted a second ago. Now that the wage does not adjust to productivity anymore, then the firm is bearing the whole risk from productivity. So you see that this covariance term is no longer multiplying marginal product minus the wage, but is multiplying the entire marginal product. Okay, because the firm is the only one that is exposed to productivity risk because the wage is fixed. So this means that the firm is going to underinvest in labor because of this risk, and the underinvestment in labor is going to create a wedge between the marginal product of labor and the marginal product of capital. Lower labor means higher marginal product of labor, even though from a risk perspective, these returns are equalized. This gap in the marginal product is essential for getting the co-movement. Why? Well, because when there is an increase in risk aversion, now that labor is riskier than capital, there is going to be a reallocation from labor to capital, from riskier to safer. But what does that do to output? Well, this wedge in marginal product is telling you that if you take a unit of output and you move it from hiring workers to buying one extra unit of capital, you're burning resources, okay? Because the marginal product of labor is higher than the marginal product of capital. So there is a net loss in doing this reallocation. And this is the first reason why output falls. Then in general equilibrium, given that output falls, the marginal product of capital is also gonna be lower, and that in turn reduces capital in equilibrium. So in this economy, you have that the fall in capital and labor is potentially freeing up some resources for consumption. But if this loss of productivity that you have in switching from labor to capital is large enough, then you can have such a big output loss that consumption is forced to fall as well. So this is the essence of the reallocation mechanism in the model. Now, you might wonder, okay, but you show me that capital and labor and employment are falling, as well as consumption is falling in the data, but we saw that part-time employment is going up. So what about part-time employment then? Does that increase in part-time employment make co-movement more likely or less likely? So to answer that, let me try to introduce part-time employment in an even simpler version of this model where I abstract altogether from capital. And now I say total employment is a combination of full-time employment and part-time employment. where these two are perfectly substitutable across each other. We have a proposition that says that if wages for full-timers are rigid and wages for part-timers are flexible, then you can once again obtain a co-movement. In this case, it's going to be a co-movement of employment and consumption alone above a certain threshold level of risk aversion. And the crucial point here is that this new threshold, gamma tilde, is going to be lower than the threshold that I had before. So when you have part-time employment, co-movement is more likely than when you don't have it. Why is that the case? Well, think about the resource constraint in this simple economy. This is telling you that the resources that are available for consumption is whatever is produced, the first two terms, minus the hiring cost of the two types of labor. So the consumption response will depend on how full-time employment and part-time employment respond. You can easily see that if full-time employment has rigid wages and part-time employment has flexible wages, then an increase in risk is going to reduce full-time employment because it's risky, as we saw before, and it's going to increase part-time employment because this is safe. So because part-time employment is actually efficient, you can show that this term that is multiplying the increase in part-time employment is actually negative. And so this means that when part-time employment is going up, consumption is actually going down. So the intuition is very simple. If as a result of an increase in risk, you decide to invest more in safer N2, well, to employ more workers in the second sector, you're going to have to use some resources. This is going to absorb resources that could have otherwise be used to sustain consumption. And so this is the reason why consumption is more likely to fall once you have a safe investment vehicle that is allowed to increase in a recession, because you leave less resources on the table for consumption to stay up. So that's basically all the analytical results that we have. To summarize, when factors of production are all equally risky, you have the classical precautionary saving motive that makes macroeconomic movement impossible. When factors of production have different riskiness, you have a gap between the marginal product of riskier versus safer factors of production. Riskier factors have higher marginal product than safer ones. When risk goes up, you're going to shift towards safer means of production, but these are going to come with lower marginal products, and this make the macroeconomic movement possible. Okay, it's even more likely if you have safer investments that can increase, like part-time workers. So in the rest of the paper, what we do is we try to quantify this mechanism by specifying a fully fledged quantitative macro model that has these notions embedded. So a quick overview of this model is that it's going to be an infinite horizon real business cycle model with the same type of preferences that I showed you before. And we're going to think about changes in shocks to risk premia as being driven by shocks to risk aversion. There is going to be a standard choice of capital with capital adjustment cost and two types of labor, a full-time labor that comes with more risk due to both sticky wages, but also longer duration contract. These are things that we see in the data, in contrast to part-time labor that has more flexible wages and shorter contract duration. So the name of the game here for the firm is going to be that when there is an increase in risk, the firm is going to readjust the composition of the inputs to become safer, but that is going to lower the productivity, and that's going to cause the fall in output. I think we go until 2:15, so let me breeze through the details. At least on the household side, there is not a lot of action happening despite the equations. So there is a standard utility maximization problem where the income of the household is coming from financial assets that are the equity shares of the firm, some corporate bonds from the firms, and some risk-free bonds that are in zero net supply. Then the household is also earning income from its work or non-work status. So some of the workers have a full-time job and they earn wage W-1. Some of the workers have a part-time job and they earn wage W-2. And the others are unemployed and they get some unemployment benefits. The other thing that is important here is that the household supplies labor to the firms exogenously in this market that has search and matching frictions. And because we have these two types of jobs available, the workers are going to search sequentially for a full-time job and a part-time job. That is, if they are unemployed, they first search for a full-time job. If they don't find a full-time job, they're going to search for a part-time job within the same period, as these periods are quarter. We think this is reasonable. And if they don't find a part-time job either, then they will stay unemployed. So these are the search dynamics that I just described. We have a risk aversion parameter, gamma, that has an index T, because that's going to be, for us, the shock that drives this risk premium fluctuations. The firm side is where the action takes place. So the firm is maximizing the discounted sum of profits using the household discount factor that is going to be subject to the shocks to risk aversion that I mentioned. And the profits are revenues minus the wage bills, minus the investment and the vacancy posting cost. As you see, production is pretty standard, Douglas in capital and labor. The underlying source of risk for the firm is going to be this productivity that could change stochastically. And then the firm accumulates capital via this capital accumulation rule. And two types of workers, full-time and part-time, that are going to be aggregated according to the CS aggregator, and that have two laws of motion that you see down here. Just a second before I turn to the question. So here I want to highlight that workers are productive within period. That's because our periods are quarters. And this is where you see the first difference between full-time and part-time workers. They're going to have different separation rates. So part-time workers are going to separate more frequently than full-time workers, and this is a source of risk for the firm. I see a raised hand. Question?
So, yeah. So when you shock the risk aversion, that might change depending on the size of the shock.
Yeah.
I guess that might change the timing to the resolution of uncertainty. Does that matter for the result?
So we're going to estimate the parameters that are related to the timing of the resolution of uncertainty. So we're going to calibrate the intertemporal elasticity substitution and estimate the risk aversion parameter. The estimate is going to be such that there is a preference for early resolution of risk or of uncertainty. We haven't really experimented with the other way around. The reason for that is you will see that in general, this model requires a substantial level of risk aversion to match the average equity premium that we see in the data. So there wouldn't be a plausible calibration where there is a preference for late resolution of risk. You would need to have a very either a very low risk aversion parameter and a very high an even higher intertemporal elasticity of substitution, which is not going to line up with any of the empirical results that we had before. So we have early preference for early resolution of uncertainty, and that's the only way in which the model can give quantitative relevant result. Yeah.
So, is the risk aversion a variable or a parameter to be estimated?
So I was referring to the average level of risk aversion. So think about the steady state level of risk aversion.
Yes, but I mean when you give it a shock, right? Depending on the size of the shock, it could even though given the steady state, you have early resolution.
Yeah.
But say if you have a really big shock to the risk aversion.
Yeah. So it's that's correct. We in the type of shocks that we consider, there is never a switch to a preference for late resolution of uncertainty. Okay. Given our, I'm not even sure that it would. Yes, we never get to that region, so I don't think that's the case that our model would tell us is quantitatively is empirically relevant. Yeah, and we never really.
Thank you. Yeah.
So first difference between the two types of workers is the separation rate. The second difference is, as you can expect, the wage. So full-time workers are going to have a sticky real wage that I'll define in a second. And then part-time workers are going to have a flexible Nash wage. That is a wage that is decided according to Nash bargaining in every period. It's useful to look at the vacancy posting condition that defines the value of a worker for a firm to see exactly what is the risk premium associated with the workers in this different types of worker in this model. So as you can imagine, the value of a worker to the firm is the present discounted value of the cash flows that the worker brings to the firm. But because of this stochastic discount factor in here, you can separate it into a component that is the risk-free cash flows. So the cash flows evaluated with the risk-free interest rate. And then a risk premium that depends on the covariance between the stochastic discount factor and these cash flows. So you can imagine that workers for which the wage, for example, does not adjust to changes in the marginal product of labor are going to be perceived as more risky. So same intuition as before. If there is a fall in productivity that is typically associated with a recession, the wage is going to stay high, but the marginal product is going to be low. That's a source of risk. But also, if you have workers that have a higher expected duration in terms of their contract, that's also going to contribute to more risk. Full-time workers are going to be riskier for both of these reasons. Finally, we close the model by specifying a process for technology that is in line with the empirical process for a TFP, the Fernald series. So it's a unit root process, and risk aversion is a stationary AR1 process. And these wages that are sticky for the full-time sector are sticky in the sense that they catch up to the unit root in technology, but not immediately. So there is a co-integration parameter, 1 minus omega. So the higher omega is, the lower is the slower is the adjustment of the wages to productivity. So the catch-up rate is low. We want to quantify the importance of the reallocation channel that I mentioned in the analytical model by doing an impulse response matching exercise. So we solve this model using a third order perturbation, and we target we try to match the responses to the risk aversion shock to the empirical responses in the VAR that we looked at before. Plus some other targets that are steady state targets. So we want our model to have a reasonable equity premium, as well as a share of part-timers that is in line with the data. That's about 20%, a long-run unemployment of about 6%, and then a volatility of employment and vacancies that give us a reasonable beverage curve. and a hiring cost relative to GDP of 1%, which is in line with parameterization of Blanchard and Galli, for example. So we have a very tightly disciplined empirical exercise because we basically have we're targeting impulse responses for 30 periods for 7 variables. So that's a lot of moments. You can think that we have basically 7 degrees of freedom that are coming from the dynamics. We calibrate a few parameters in these models. So one was coming up before is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. We use a fairly high value, which is in line with this literature, financial literature that uses this Epstein-Zinn preferences. The results stay there also with a lower IES parameter. This is mainly responsible for the relative response of consumption and investment to the shock. Then some of these other parameters are relatively standard. The thing that is new is that we calibrate the separation rate for full-timers and part-timers to match micro evidence that part-timers separate 8 times more frequently than full-time workers. And then the levels, so that's about the ratio of ρ1 to ρ2. The level is chosen such that the average separation rate is 10% per quarter, which is in line with the evidence, micro evidence. And then the productivity shock process is estimated to have a standard deviation of 0.008 from estimating a unit root process on the Fernald series for productivity. It's important to have these 2 types of workers and these 2 different separation rates, because an early critique to an idea that changes in risk premia could be responsible for overall unemployment fluctuations put forth by Borovichka and Borovichkova was that there doesn't seem to be enough risk in the average worker in the economy to explain employment fluctuations due to changes in risk. But our insight is to realize that you don't necessarily have to look at average workers. If you have different types of workers, then the risk of full-time workers can be actually higher than the risk of the average worker in the economy. And this is why the explanation of risk-driven fluctuations in unemployment can actually be empirically plausible. We estimate the rest of the parameters. So not much to say here. We discussed the estimates in the paper. We have a steady state level of risk aversion that is on the high side for micro evidence, but if you look at the literature that tries to match asset pricing moments and business cycle moments using macro models, this is actually on the average or on the lower side, I would say. And this is the main result. So the estimation is able to, so our estimated model is able to give risk-driven business cycles. That is, after an increase in risk aversion, there is a sharp and persistent increase in risk premia and a fall in all the macro aggregates, output, consumption, investment, and employment. We can also get the sharp fall in stock returns and the quick rebound. And crucially for the result, there is an increase in part-time workers that is at the heart of the reallocation that we discussed before. Indeed, the model is also quite good at capturing not only conditional moments in response to risk aversion shocks, but also unconditional moments, in particular volatility of macro variables, as well as the share of part-time workers, as well as asset pricing moments, such that the standard deviation of risk premia, the sharp ratio that we find in the data, and a relatively low and stable risk-free rate.
So you have 2 shocks in this model, right? The productivity shock and the risk aversion shock, right?
Exactly. So this unconditional moment table is telling you about what's happening when there are the two shocks active. Yeah.
Right. So then which shock has matched the because here you show the unconditional moments, but my question is which shock match the moments more better?
Well, so we haven't done
Conditional.
table for one shock separate from the other. So the I think the point of the previous picture was to show you that conditional on the risk aversion shock, we have the empirically relevant dynamics. We don't know in the data exactly how this table would look if you were to condition just on one shock. That's why this is a table that is trying to answer the question, okay, unconditionally, does our model deliver like reasonable fluctuations in macro and financial variables? And yeah, that's how we approach it.
Okay, thank you.
So the reason why the model works in the way that I described before is exactly that there are different riskiness of these different types of investment that the firm can do. And here you can see the numbers from the estimated model. The full-time labor is perceived to have a risk premium has a steady state risk premium of about 10%, which is much higher than that on capital and subsequently part-time labor. So this is the reason why when there is an increase in risk premium, in risk aversion, there is a sharp increase in the full-time risk premium. And for this reason, firms shift away from posting vacancies in the full-time sector, and they shift towards capital and towards part-time labor. That explains why part-time labor increases a lot in response to this particular shock. And I think I am basically out of time. Is that correct?
Yeah, but you can like finish it. Yeah.
So just a note on the importance of these part-timers. We show in the paper that you can see it also from the impulse responses that they are quite important for this reallocation. And in fact, the labor reallocation explains about 1/3 of the fall in output conditional on this risk aversion shocks. And overall, it's a story about risk and flight to safety. We substantiate this point in the paper by doing a counterfactual exercise where we shut off entirely the risk premium channel. That is, we replace if you want, the firms in the economy with firms that are risk neutral with respect to the cash flows that the workers provide, so that when you have a change in risk aversion, there is no movement in this term by definition. And when you shut off the riskiness of full-time labor, then you can see from this picture in the black lines that the model loses all the ability to deliver meaningful fluctuations in macro variables. And it also gives you back the co-movement problem that investment goes up and consumption goes down. So this is to highlight that it's really the risk on the full time that is at the heart of the action in this model. So let me just conclude by saying what we have done. We wanted to make progress on this idea of risk-driven business cycles. We have shown empirically that risk premia are strongly associated with macro fluctuations. And we wrote a model when the causality can go from premia to macro fluctuations. The key idea is that when there is an increase in risk, there is a reallocation towards safety, but going towards safety also means that you're shifting towards less productive stores of value, and this can be an important source of loss of output and potentially a full-fledged recession. We think that this captures many qualitative and quantitative features of the cycles. We have focused a lot on labor market outcomes given our empirical results, but we think that the same reallocation story can be important to study also other questions related to other forms of saving. Think about risky in private investments versus government bonds, or also foreign investment opportunities for open economies. So these are all things that we are excited to explore in the future or see people take up in future research. Thanks a lot for your time and for your questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's see if we have any other questions from the audience.
Yeah, so my question is that, so in your DSG estimation model, you have the multi-period corporate bound there. So I'm wondering what is the role of this multi-period corporate bound relative to the 7 variable bar model? We didn't see the corporate bound information.
Yes. So the multi-period corporate bond is there for us to introduce financial leverage in the model. And this is useful because we want our model to be able to capture the average equity risk premium that we see in the data. Now, this risk premium that we see in the data is from firms that are financially leveraged. So we need to have a concept of leverage also inside the model. So the corporate bonds allow us to have a notion of equity risk premium that is aligned with the data, which is a leveraged equity risk premium. But the other thing that's important to note is that in our model there are no financial frictions or asymmetric information problem. So this introduction of the corporate bond and the split of the financing of the firm via equity or bonds only affect the pricing of equity cash flows, so the risk premium, but it doesn't affect the optimal choice of the firm in terms of labor or output and these things, because the Modigliani-Miller theorem still holds. Yeah.